Hello, everybody. I would like to thank the organizer of this event. I would like to greet Dr. Fernand de Varennes, as well as all the participants. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk about the grievance of ethnic and religious minorities in Iran. Iran is composed of different ethnic and religious groups. The non-Persian ethnic minorities make up more than half of the Iranian population. The main minorities groups are Kurds, Turkish-speaking Azeris, Arabs, Baluch, Lur, and a smaller population of Armenians and Turkmen. Indeed, in Iran, there is no minority who has the majority. Since the creation of modern Iranian state nation in 1906, the rulers in Tehran have imposed a brutal chauvinistic system based on the supremacy of the Persian ethnicity and of the Shiite faith. Non-Persian peoples are denied the right to public education in their own language. Forced Farsi language education is one major tool used by the Iranian regime to forcibly assimilate its non-Persian minorities. Here I gave one example of those discriminations against the minority in Iran. For example, according to the Article 115 of to have qualifications of a candidate for presidential in Iran, he has to have convinced belief in the fundamental principles of the Islamic Republic of Iran and the official mazhab of the country. This is the case in other high-ranking government posts, for example, for the Kurds who cannot accede. Since the declaration of fatwa by Ayatollah Khomeini against the Kurdish people in Iran in 1979, more than 10,000 Kurds, including civilians and Peshmerga, have lost their lives, and this violence continues till today. According to the Kurdish human rights groups, only in 2020, over 500 Iranian Kurds, including human rights defenders, were arrested for politically motivated reasons and charged with broad and vaguely worded national security-related offenses. According to the UN Special Rapporteur on Iran, Kurdish political prisoners charged with national security offenses constitute a disproportionately high number of those who received the death penalty and are executed. Till today, Kurds are deprived of their basic rights. Iran is accusing the Kurds to be secessionists for justifying its repression. However, the main Kurdish political parties in Iranian Kurdistan seeking an internal self-determination in form of federal system. The policy of denial by the Iranian government pushed many Kurds to opt for independence because they are convinced that no rights of the Kurds can be obtained within this chauvinistic system. The question is that if the right for full self-determination is justified by flagrant, serious human rights violation, it is happening now in Iranian Kurdistan because there is persistent oppression, targeted killings, domination, discrimination, marginalization, and injustice. The Kurds are denied any meaningful exercise of its rights to self-determination. Their representatives are excluded from any decision-making, especially in matters affecting the well-being and security of Kurdish people. the politic of linguistics carried out and Kurdish culture is suppressed. The discrimination against Kurdish regions is constitutionalized. As my question to Dr. Fernand de Varennes is that in what circumstances the remedial cessation can be applied as a solution? Thank you for listening.
Many thanks. Many thanks to the Centre Zagros pour les droits de l'homme and the Global Tamil Movement for this kind invitation to meet with you and briefly to address this online meeting on the right of self-determination of nations and minorities. Unfortunately, I will have to leave in about 10 minutes because of other commitments, but I did listen very carefully to what the points that have been raised in relation to the situation in Iran, Cameroon, and Sri Lanka, and others also generally, which I know exists out there. I think perhaps one point that needs to be recognized and admitted is that these are very difficult and even dark days around the world in many areas. There's the impact of the pandemic, which has been affecting certain communities, certain minorities, and vulnerable populations, such as women and children, very significantly. Ongoing wars in Syria, Yemen, and the Ukraine, and other parts of the world, including, as we've just heard, in Cameroon, there's atrocities and violence also being committed in places like Iran and many others. We have also an environment around us which is threatening and unstable and affects also some of our communities, and particularly some nations and minorities very significantly and very dramatically. And in many ways, we look around at the world around us, and we look at what is happening within the United Nations, and we're seeing that perhaps the human rights architecture and the United Nations in its role is not able to protect the world's most vulnerably as much as it should. Many issues, some of the issues that you raised here during this meeting are almost never discussed at the General Assembly or at the UN Human Rights Council, or in a very superficial way. And in fact, and once again, I think we need to be quite honest, the issue of some of the most vulnerable communities, such as minorities, but also unrepresented peoples and the nations are under occupation, are contested and even disregarded in many of the United Nations institutions. Now, I don't have answers to many of those questions, many of your questions, but I wish to emphasize the importance of telling the United Nations to do more, to telling the organizations that you are involved with as much as possible, and even in some cases, states, governments that you may have good relations with, that the United Nations has to do much more to address particularly situations as we have heard for Southern Cameroon and Iran and other parts of the world, because in reality, we have nations, we have minorities, we have peoples that are asking for self-determination, whose voices and presence is often never admitted, never recognized. I am an independent expert of the United Nations. I do not represent the United Nations. I can tell you that I have had dealings in UN offices in different parts of the world where they did not want to talk about the rights of minorities. Very clearly, I was told they will deny, in fact, that there are minorities in some. I can tell you that in Cameroon, I have had officials saying, well, there is no real minority in Southern Cameroon because the population there are African. They're not English speaking. I've had this actually told to me directly. And here it is a problem because, and here I have to speak directly about my mandate. My mandate is limited to the rights of minorities. But as you know, and I think we have to say this, and this is an issue, a number of issues that I have been raising many times. Most of the world's conflicts today, violent conflicts, wars, internal conflicts, there are minority issues. And here I use the term minority in a general sense. It can be a religious minority, it can be an ethnic minority, can be a linguistic minority. They could also claim to be indigenous peoples in some situations. And there's nothing that actually says that they cannot be nations. But my mandate, and I must say this very clearly, my mandate is limited to minorities. But minorities can be inclusive of many different categories without excluding anyone and any other rights. But today, around the world, most of the conflicts involve minority groups, ethnic groups, against a state which they do not for because they are quite often, they have long-standing grievances, exclusion, discrimination, violence, and denial that they are actual equal citizens. You know this. You've heard this in many situations around the world. And that is why quite often you will have these minorities, nations, peoples, who make claims of self-determination because they don't have that, they need to have a degree of political control of their community and their destiny. And under self-determination, this is perhaps one of the possibilities for this kind of protection that can be perhaps achieved through some form of self-determination. Most conflicts involve minorities. Most hate speech in social media, the targets of most hate speech in social media are minorities. Most of the world's quarters of the world's stateless people, millions of individuals that are denied any citizenship are minorities. I could go on and on and on, but these are some of the main challenges that we have at the 21st century, which are not being responded to sufficiently, in my view, by the United Nations. But I'm an optimist. I have to be an eternal optimist because that's my job in a sense. That's my mission. Just last year, the permanent mission of Liechtenstein to the United Nations in New York published a major report called the Handbook on the Prevention and Resolution of Self-Determination Conflicts. That's the theme also of your meeting. And I would urge you to have a copy. It's available on the internet, it's free. But you have here one government of a country in the world saying, and allow me to quote directly what they're saying, one of their main conclusions. They're saying, and I quote, "Full respect for the human rights of minority and indigenous communities is key to the prevention of self-determination conflicts. Many self-determination conflicts emerge from violations of the human rights of indigenous peoples and peoples belonging to ethnic, religious, and linguistic minorities, most frequently relating to the legal system, language, and culture." There are governments in the world that agree, that understand this, and hopefully are willing to move in this direction. I mention this because it is also the most direct and clear suggestion that minorities, and also indigenous peoples, and peoples in a colonial context, may have also a right to some form of self-determination. Some cases it's internal, meaning inside a country, but a degree of autonomy and power to ensure that they can control their own political community and destiny. This is not a popular position to adopt these days at the United Nations. I think we have to acknowledge this. But in fact, there are many who really, for different reasons, want to avoid even talking about minorities, and that the current political and ideological trends that we're seeing in many countries is a rise of majoritarian nationalism, that the nation dominated by one particular group is become more and more intolerant and even abusive and violent towards minorities. We have to recognize this, and we have to do more with United Nations institutions to wake them up. And I will have to go in a few minutes, but the word wake up, I think is important here. This year is the 30th anniversary of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Minorities. And it is clear that we need to do more and to do much better. The theme of this year's many activities, including regional meetings under my mandate that is being held for Asia, Pacific, Africa and the Middle East, Europe, and the Americas as a whole, is to review, rethink, and learn. We need a new blueprint for the future at the United Nations to deal with minorities and other claims, such as what I would say self-determination in the way proposed by the government of Liechtenstein. So I would ask you, I would invite you to write to the United Nations, the ArcHR in particular, talking about creating a global Nations and Minorities caucus to move forward and to do a lot of the same initiatives very effectively of indigenous peoples. But we need to put on the agenda of the United Nations much, much, much more higher on the agenda of the United Nations, something stronger, some more approach, understanding, talking about self-determination for minorities and other groups at the UN, because that is not happening. A blueprint for the future, talking about minorities, talking about autonomy, talking about actually having the United Nations play a much greater role in the situations as we've seen, as we've heard with South Cameroon, with Iran, in many other parts of the world. We could go on and on, of course, but I think this is one point that I wanted to share with you. And I will, I have to leave in about 5 minutes, but I'm hoping that we have time for further exchanges on this. Thank you so much.